He covered more than 15,000 kilometers across the ancient world. He walked along Roman stone roads, dirt paths, trade routes, and mountain passes. He crossed the Mediterranean Sea in cargo ships, traveled through empires, and entered some of the most influential cities in history. The missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul were not symbolic. They were long, grueling, dangerous, and decisive expeditions that helped spread Christianity across 3 continents. In Acts 22-21, we read that Paul was sent by God to the Gentiles, commissioned to carry the gospel beyond the borders of Israel. For about 30 years, he traveled through regions like Syria, Cilicia, Galatia, Asia Minor, Macedonia, Achaia, and Italy, connecting the strategic cities of the Roman Empire. What follows is not just the story of an apostle. It is the reconstruction of one of the greatest journeys of the ancient world. Paul's first major missionary journey begins in Antioch of Syria, one of the most important centers of early Christianity. Acts 13:1-3 records that the church in Antioch, after prayer and fasting, set apart Paul and Barnabas for missionary work. Antioch was home to an estimated 200,000 to 500,000 people, making it one of the largest metropolises in the Eastern Roman Empire. 3. The city featured wide avenues, bustling markets, Roman administrative buildings, densely populated neighborhoods, and a strategic location between land and sea trade routes. Leaving Antioch, Paul and Barnabas headed for the port of Seleucia, as described in Acts 13-4. The distance between them was about 25 kilometers, traveled on foot along secondary Roman roads through valleys, farms, and trade routes. This leg required a full day of walking under the hot Syrian sun, with the constant threat of robbers in less guarded areas. In Seleucia, Paul boarded a merchant ship bound for Cyprus. The sea journey from Seleucia to Salamis, on the eastern coast of Cyprus, covered roughly 250 kilometers across the Mediterranean. First-century cargo ships were square-sailed vessels dependent on the wind, carrying goods, sailors, and passengers in cramped, uncomfortable conditions. Acts 13:4-5 records Paul's arrival in Salamis, one of Cyprus's main port cities. Salamis had between 30,000 and 100,000 residents, with active harbors, markets, synagogues, pagan temples, paved streets, and lively trade between the East and the Greek world. From Salamis, Paul crossed the island on foot to Paphos. As noted in Acts 13-6, the distance exceeded 150 kilometers, traveled along coastal roads and inland paths through farmland, villages, and mountainous terrain. This trek took 6 to 8 days of continuous walking, including time for rest, meals, and sharing the gospel along the way. In Paphos, Paul confronted the sorcerer Elymas before the proconsul Sergius Paulus. As recorded in Acts 13:6-12, the outcome was the conversion of a Roman, officially a clear sign that the Christian message was beginning to reach the power structures of the empire. This first journey set the pattern for Paul's later travels: long distances, a mix of land and sea, strategic cities, and spiritual impact on political and cultural centers. But Cyprus was just the beginning. The next stage would take Paul into the heart of Asia Minor, crossing new territories, climbing mountain ranges, facing more intense persecution, and entering cities that would shape the future of Christian expansion. To understand how Paul moved beyond the islands into the continental interior, we must follow the route that led him from the coast to Pisidian Antioch, one of the most demanding legs of his first mission. After crossing Cyprus, Paul's journey shifted from the coast to the mountainous interior of Asia Minor. Acts 13:13 records that Paul and his companions sailed from Paphos to Perga in Pamphylia. The sea voyage covered roughly 400 kilometers in wind-dependent cargo ships, without modern navigation tools and at the mercy of sudden weather changes. Perga was a significant regional city with an estimated 20,000 to 50,000 residents, connected to trade routes linking the coast to inner Anatolia. It featured paved streets, monumental gates, colonnades, public baths, a theater, and drainage systems, hallmarks of Roman urban planning. But the real test began when the route left the coast. Acts 13:14 records that the group pressed on to Pisidian Antioch of Baji, crossing considered one of the hardest of the first journey. The distance from Perga to Pisidian Antioch exceeded 160 kilometers, traveled on foot from sea level to mountainous regions over 1,000 meters high. This leg required 2 to 3 weeks of walking along elevated Roman roads, through narrow valleys, forested areas, and regions known for raids and instability. The Roman roads on this route were built with multiple stone layers to support military and commercial traffic, complete with drainage, mile markers, and graded inclines to prevent erosion. Still, walking them meant extreme physical strain, intense heat by day, cold at higher elevations at night, scarce water in some stretches, and constant risk of ambush. Pisidian Antioch was a strategic Roman colony with 50,000 to 100,000 residents, situated on a high plateau that allowed military and commercial control of the area. Acts 13:16-41 records Paul preaching in the local synagogue, reaching both Jews and Gentiles. But this progress also sparked fierce opposition. Acts 13:45-50 describes persecution and organized resistance against the message. Still, the route pressed on. This stage established a clear pattern. Paul's journeys didn't follow easy paths. They pushed through the longest, most dangerous, and most strategic corridors of the Roman world, connecting highland cities, administrative centers, and key regions for cultural and commercial exchange. And the next route would take Paul even farther inland, through smaller towns, secondary roads, and territories where reception was uncertain. Distances were long, and risks even greater. To understand how the route advanced to Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, we must trace the land corridor through the heart of Anatolia, one of the most demanding stretches of the entire mission. Leaving Pisidian Antioch, Paul's route led to Iconium. Acts 14:2-5 records that the spread of the message caused division and urban unrest, forcing the mission to move on. From Iconium, Paul went to Lystra. The distance between them was about 30 to 50 kilometers, traveled along narrow rural roads with less infrastructure and greater isolation. Lystra was a smaller, more rural city with perhaps 5,000 to 20,000 residents deeply tied to agriculture, herding, and local trade. Even in less urbanized areas, these routes held strategic importance, linking villages, colonies, and smaller administrative centers. From Lystra, the route continued to Derbe. The distance was roughly 60 to 80 kilometers, again covered on foot along inland paths with little Roman oversight and greater exposure to natural and human dangers. In this stretch alone, Paul traveled some 250 to 300 kilometers, almost entirely on foot, through varying climates, terrain, and levels of security. These inland routes were vital for carrying the message beyond the major centers, reaching rural areas, peripheral towns, and populations outside the empire's main axis. But after reaching the limits of this inland expansion, the mission did something unusual. It turned back along the same paths, retracing dangerous routes, revisiting unstable cities, and consolidating key points before moving into a new phase. To understand how the route reorganized, doubled back, and prepared for the second great phase of the journeys, we must follow this strategic return and the opening of new continental frontiers. This meant retracing about 250 to 300 kilometers on foot. These roads weren't just traveled, they were reinforced. After completing the inland circuit, the route returned to Perga in Pamphylia, as described in Acts 14:25. This stage again involved roughly 160 kilometers of walking, descending from the highlands of Pisidia to the coastal plain. In Perga, the route resumed its maritime focus. Acts 14:26 records that Paul traveled to Italia, a key port on the southern coast of Asia Minor. The distance between Perga and Italia was about 15 to 20 kilometers, covered along coastal roads, linking the interior to the Roman port system. Italia served as a maritime hub, connecting Anatolia to the trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean. From there, the route sailed back to Antioch in Syria. The sea crossing between Italia and Antioch covered roughly 400 to 500 kilometers. With the return to Antioch, the first major phase of the journey was complete. Adding the outward leg, inland circuits, return by land, and sea travel, this first phase totaled somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 kilometers, most of it on foot, establishing a missionary corridor linking the Mediterranean coast to the deep interior of Asia Minor. But this return didn't mark the end of expansion. It set the stage for something even larger. The next phase would carry the mission out of Asia, crossing new frontiers along major imperial roads and entering territory that would dramatically expand the geographic reach of the gospel. To understand how the routes advanced into Europe, we must follow the second major phase of the journeys, when the paths extended into Macedonia and beyond. Acts 15:36-41 records that the route resumed from Antioch in Syria, passing through Syria and Cilicia. This initial stretch covered roughly 300 to 400 kilometers overland, along major Roman roads built for military, commercial, and administrative use. These imperial roads were constructed with multiple stone layers, compacted foundations, paved surfaces, and mile markers, indicating official distances between cities. From Tarsus, one of Cilicia's main urban centers, the route advanced into the interior of Galatia. This stretch again involved long land distances across plateaus, agricultural valleys, and mid-sized cities, adding hundreds more kilometers on foot. Next, the route reached the port city of Troas on the Aegean coast. Troas served as a strategic crossing point between Asia and Europe, with port facilities, warehouses, markets, and steady traffic of merchant ships. From there, the journey shifted from a purely continental axis to include a decisive sea crossing. Acts 16:9-11 recounts that the route crossed the Aegean Sea toward Macedonia, marking the official entry into European territory. The crossing from Troas to Neapolis covered roughly 250 kilometers, made in merchant ships at the mercy of wind and sea conditions. After landing at Neapolis, the route continued overland to Philippi, covering about 15 to 20 kilometers along one of the most impressive feats of Roman engineering, the Via Egnatia. This monumental imperial road linked the Adriatic to the Aegean, crossing Macedonia and connecting the east to the heart of Roman Europe. Built with stone layers, side drainage, structural bridges, and distance markers, it enabled rapid movement of troops, goods, and travelers. Adding the land journey from Antioch to Troas, plus the sea crossing and arrival in Philippi, this phase of the route totaled roughly 1,000 to 1,500 additional kilometers. This movement represented an unprecedented territorial expansion. The missionary routes now connected the Middle East, Anatolia, and the European continent, forming an intercontinental corridor within the Roman Empire. But crossing into Macedonia was only the beginning. From there, the routes would continue through major European urban centers, traveling heavily trafficked imperial roads, entering densely populated cities, and reaching regions that would become new centers of cultural, economic, and spiritual influence. To understand how the expansion pressed forward through the main cities of Roman Europe, we must follow the next stretch of the Via Egnatia through Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. The first major stop on this European route was Philippi, as recorded in Acts 16:12. Philippi was a strategic Roman colony with 10,000 to 50,000 residents, made up of military veterans, merchants, and colonists. From Philippi, the route continued for about 160 kilometers along the Via Egnatia to Thessalonica. Thessalonica was one of Macedonia's largest cities, with an estimated 50,000 to 200,000 inhabitants. It had an active port, extensive markets, and constant circulation of goods for across the Mediterranean. The route then moved on to Berea, as recorded in Acts 17:10-12. The distance between Thessalonica and Berea was about 70 to 80 kilometers. Berea was a medium-sized city with perhaps 20,000 to 50,000 residents. Adding the journeys through Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea, the route covered roughly 300 to 400 kilometers within European territory. This stage marked a turning point. The missionary routes now traversed the heart of Roman Europe, following the same roads used by legions, governors, merchants, and imperial messengers. But expansion would not stop in northern Greece. The next stage would take the route to the intellectual center of the Greek world, crossing new regions, heading south and entering a city where ideas shaped empires and architecture symbolized cultural power. To understand how the routes reached Athens, we must follow the axis connecting Macedonia to the heart of mainland Greece, one of antiquity's most symbolic corridors. After crossing Macedonia, the missionary route left the Via Egnatia and turned south through mainland Greece, advancing toward one of the ancient world's most influential urban and cultural centers, Athens. The journey from Berea to Athens, as indicated in Acts 17:14-15, covered roughly 300 to 400 kilometers overland, using a mix of regional roads, trade routes, and coastal stretches. This path crossed fertile plains, mountain ranges, agricultural valleys, and densely populated areas integrated into the Roman economic and administrative system. In the first century, Athens had an estimated 50,000 to 150,000 residents and was recognized as one of the greatest intellectual, philosophical, and educational centers of antiquity. Its urban infrastructure was highly developed, including the Acropolis with its monumental temples, the Parthenon standing as both architectural and religious symbol. The city functioned as a hub of cultural diffusion, where philosophical, religious, and scientific ideas circulated intensely. The arrival in Athens marked the definitive entry of missionary routes into the symbolic heart of Greek civilization. Adding the journey from Macedonia to Athens, the route accumulated another 300 to 500 kilometers, most covered on foot along stone roads and ancient paths. But this would not be the final point in Greek territory. The next stage would take the route to one of the Mediterranean's largest commercial centers, a colossal port city connected to international maritime routes, with advanced infrastructure and a reputation as one of the wealthiest and most strategic points in the Roman world. To understand how the routes advanced from Athens to Corinth, we must follow the land corridor linking central Greece to the narrow isthmus that connected two seas. After Athens, the route moved on to Corinth. As recorded in Acts 18:1, the journey between them covered about 80 to 100 kilometers overland, along paved regional roads through central Greece until reaching the heart of Corinth. Corinth occupied one of the most strategic geographic positions in the Roman world. It sat on the narrow land bridge connecting mainland Greece to the Peloponnese, linking two seas, the Aegean to the east and the Ionian to the west. This position made Corinth a maritime and overland logistics hub through which goods, travelers, disassembled ships, and commercial cargo all passed. The city controlled two main ports, Century on the Aegean and Lechium on the Ionian. Between them lay the Diolkos, a monumental engineering achievement, a stone road built to transport ships overland on grooved tracks, avoiding the dangerous sea voyage around the Peloponnese. In the first century, Corinth had an estimated 100,000 to 250,000 residents, including Roman citizens, Greeks, foreign merchants, sailors, and dockworkers. The city boasted large-scale urban infrastructure. Corinth functioned as an international economic center, where global maritime routes met imperial land routes, creating an environment of constant flow of people, ideas, and goods. By integrating Corinth into the circuit, the missionary routes began crossing one of the largest commercial hubs of the Roman world, connecting the European axis, the Eastern Mediterranean, and routes leading directly to Italy. Adding the journey from Athens to Corinth, plus internal routes through the isthmus region. The route accumulated another 100 to 150 kilometers, establishing a strategic corridor between the intellectual heart of Greece and its greatest commercial center. But expansion wouldn't stop at the isthmus. After a period in Corinth, the route crossed the Aegean again and returned to Asia Minor, this time reaching Ephesus. The sea crossing between Greece and the coast of Asia covered roughly 300 to 400 kilometers. Made in merchant ships dependent on seasonal winds and eastern Mediterranean currents, Ephesus was one of the largest and wealthiest cities of the Roman East, with an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 residents. Located near the mouth of the Cayster River, Ephesus had a strategic port connected to maritime routes linking the Aegean, the Greek islands, Macedonia, Syria, Egypt, and Italy. Beyond its sea lanes, Ephesus was also crossed by imperial roads connecting the coast to the interior of Anatolia, making it a logistical hub between coastal and continental trade. The city's infrastructure was monumental. Among its features, the Library of Celsus, one of the most impressive in the Roman world. The Great Theater, seating about 25,000 spectators. The Arcadian Way, a grand avenue linking the port to the city center. Aqueducts, public fountains, marble-paved streets, large markets, and densely structured residential quarters. Ephesus was also home to the Temple of Artemis, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, a colossal religious complex drawing pilgrims, merchants, and travelers from across the Mediterranean. Adding the maritime journey from Corinth to Ephesus, plus internal routes through the metropolis and its surroundings, the route accumulated another 300 to 500 kilometers, building an axis that connected Greece, Asia Minor, and the major routes of the eastern Mediterranean. Acts 19:10 records that from Ephesus, all the inhabitants of the province of Asia heard the word, evidence of a wide territorial expansion. Among the major urban centers connected to Ephesus were Colossae, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Pergamum, Sardis, Smyrna, and Magnesia. Distances between these cities typically ranged from 50 to 150 kilometers, covered by paved Roman regional roads with stone bridges, drainage, and mile markers. This road network allowed routes to spread in multiple directions, connecting the Aegean coast, the mountainous interior of Anatolia, fertile agricultural valleys, and trade corridors extending toward the Levant and Syria. In addition to land routes, Ephesus maintained strong maritime links, allowing travel not only on foot, but also by coastal navigation between regional ports. Adding the radial movements from Ephesus both land and sea, it is estimated that the routes accumulated another 500 to 800 kilometers, forming a regional logistical network rather than just a linear path. Acts 20:1-3 records that the journey continued toward Macedonia and then Greece, forming a continuous transcontinental circuit. The initial crossing from Ephesus to Macedonia involved sailing the Aegean, covering roughly 300 to 400 kilometers. Upon reaching Macedonia again, the routes returned to the Via Egnatia axis, passing through already connected cities and reinforcing a permanent European corridor. This phase involved travel through cities like Philippi, Thessalonica, and regional centers tied to the interior of the Balkans. The land portions of this European circuit totaled roughly 400 to 600 kilometers. After crossing Macedonia, the route advanced again to mainland Greece. Arriving in Corinth, the journey between Macedonia and Corinth could exceed 500 kilometers overland, crossing agricultural valleys, mountain ranges, and dense urban zones connected by regional imperial roads. By reintegrating Corinth into the circuit, the routes began to form a geographic ring linking Asia Minor, Macedonia, Greece, and the main ports of the eastern Mediterranean. Adding the land and sea movements of this phase between Ephesus, Macedonia, and Greece, the circuit accumulated roughly 700 to 1,000 additional kilometers, forming a stable and recurring route system rather than just exploratory journeys. This stage marked a strategic shift. The routes now not only advanced, They repeated themselves, reinforced one another, and stabilized, becoming permanent corridors of circulation. But this return would not end the journey. The next phase would take the movement through one of the longest and most dangerous stretches of the entire expansion, involving extended coastal crossings, successive ports, and a journey culminating in a return to the Levant and the region of Jerusalem. To understand how the routes advanced through the eastern Mediterranean toward the east, we must follow the long maritime return through Troas, Miletus, Tyre, and Caesarea. Acts 20:6-16 records that the route set out from Troas, crossing the Aegean and moving along the coast of Asia Minor. Each sea crossing covered distances between 50 and 200 kilometers, made in coastal merchant ships that sailed from port to port, taking advantage of favorable winds, local currents, and the shelter of the coastline. The total accumulated distance of this coastal return can be estimated between 1,000 and 1,500 kilometers, linking Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, the Syro-Phoenician coast, and the Levantan corridor. After passing Tyre, the route continued to Caesarea Maritima, as recorded in Acts 21:7-16. Caesarea was one of the largest artificial harbors in the Roman Empire, equipped with a complex system of hydraulic concrete breakwaters, a remarkable feat of Roman engineering. The port could accommodate large commercial vessels, directly connecting the Levant to the sea routes of Egypt, Asia Minor, and Italy. Adding the full coastal route from Troas, through the Aegean Islands, the Anatolian coast, Phoenicia, and Caesarea, the final circuit added another 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers to the overall total. The journey no longer represented isolated movements. It was now a continuous map of interconnected paths, a geographic corridor of thousands of kilometers linking continents, seas, monumental cities, and international ports. But the greatest crossing was still ahead. The next stage would lead the movement out of the eastern axis, toward the heart of the Roman Empire on a route marked by storms, long open sea voyages, and the path to Rome. Acts 27:1-44 describes the great sea voyage that departed from Caesarea Maritima toward Italy, passing through intermediate ports, open seas, and extremely dangerous navigational zones. The initial route followed the Levantine coast to Sidon, then advanced toward Myra in Lycia. The crossing of the central Mediterranean covered more than 2,000 kilometers facing contrary winds, open water, and long periods without sighting land. The ship approached Crete. It was caught in a violent storm known as the Euroclydon. For 14 days, the vessel drifted across hundreds of kilometers without control until running aground on the island of Malta, as recorded in Acts 27:27-44. Adding the journey from Caesarea through Sidon, Myra, Crete, the open sea, and Malta. This phase totaled approximately 2,500 to 3,000 kilometers of continuous sailing, making it the longest sea voyage of the entire circuit. After wintering on Malta, as recorded in Acts 28:111, the route resumed on a new ship, passing through Syracuse, Rhegium, and Puteoli. From Puteoli, the journey continued overland to Rome, covering roughly 250 kilometers along the Appian Way, one of the oldest and most monumental roads of the Roman Empire. The complete system of roads traversed reached an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 kilometers in total, most of it covered on foot, or by merchant vessel crossing 3 continents, dozens of major cities, and the main logistical corridors of the ancient world. The journey finally reached Rome, as recorded in Acts 28-1416. In the first century, Rome was an imperial megacity with an estimated 1 to 2 million residents. It was equipped with monumental roads, colossal aqueducts, vast forums, river ports on the Tiber, imperial warehouses, unprecedented administrative infrastructure, and an urban system that concentrated the political and economic power of the Roman world. At this point, the map of the routes was complete. The roads had connected Jerusalem and the Levant, Asia Minor, Greece, and Macedonia. the eastern and central Mediterranean, and the capital of the largest empire of antiquity. The journey was not merely a sequence of movements. Tea became one of the largest systems of geographical circulation ever recorded in the ancient world. A living map of interconnected roads, ports, seas, and cities. And when we observe this route in its entirety, we realize that the missionary journeys were not just religious displacements. They formed a true continental corridor connecting cultures, economies, urban centers, and entire continents through stone roads, maritime routes, and imperial ports. The path began on dusty roads in the east and ended on the monumental highways of Rome. But the roads that were opened did not close there. They continued to shape cultural, religious, and historical routes for centuries after that journey. Because in the end, it wasn't just cities that were connected. It was entire continents, united by a single system of